afternoon, we'll convene our special meeting, and Ms. Koto, if you'll introduce our subject matter expert for our work session.
Thank you, Chairman, Commissioners. This is the day in which the budget that staff has been working on for probably about 6 or 7 months goes from being the county manager's recommended budget into the hands of the Board of County Commissioners. It becomes your budget in order to give us direction and take whatever action you choose. Jeff Yates is going to be going through highlights of what is contained within the budget. We do welcome questions so that we can ensure you completely understand what is contained within the budget, and if we're able to answer any questions that you may have as it relates to the budget. So with that, I will turn it over to Mr. Yates. The one other thing that I will say is this budget does not contain the Union County Public Schools. The reason it does not is they have until May 15th in which to submit their budget to us. At that point in time, once we receive that submittal, we will then forward it to the Board of County Commissioners. And we've made some suggestions as to joint meetings. Obviously, it's contingent upon the Board of Education as to whether or not they wish to do that, but we think it would be helpful for them to come and present their budget to you all formally. And we will leave that between the respective chairs to work that out. So with that, Mr. Yates.
Okay, so Cindy mentioned where we're at in the process is all the departments have been working 1st of November timeframe up until last week to kind of work through their budgets, work on their capital submissions, work on all those components. So what you have in front of you for the books that you were delivered in the presentation tonight is the culmination of that. And this is, Cindy mentioned, this is where it crosses over. It goes from the county manager's proposed budget at this point becomes the commission's budget for you to deliberate over. And, sorry. So today we're going to talk a little bit about the process. I want to update you, kind of talk about where we are with two new commissioners. I want to kind of lay out what happens from here. The general overview of the manager's proposed budget, including the capital, general fund highlights and discussion, water and sewer fund, update of the volunteer fire department funding, the EMS funding, our community partners, and then kind of what you can expect from here on through June. Because we have about the next 8 weeks that we need to settle this issue one way or the other, and adopt a budget, set a tax rate, and those other things. So where you are in the process, particularly for the 2 new commissioners. Last year we started this, what we call our bifurcated process, and it's basically where you go in 2 separate tracks to talk about the county's budget and the school's budget. So if you look at the blue column, we're at May 4th, the county manager presents the operating budget less the schools. We have built in, we have some time in May if you wanted to have another work session, but typically what we would do is this is your work session on budget. And if you remember back into the process, we've already had multiple budget work sessions. It all started really with the projections work session we had the 1st of February. We talked about our budget focus areas over 4 different meetings. So this isn't the first time we're talking budgets. Sometimes the way other localities do it is we would bring it all to you tonight, and this would be the first time you're seeing it. But you've really kind of seen the hot button issues, and we talked about a lot of the bigger issues already. And that's been baked in to this recommendation that you have in front of you tonight. It's kind of the direction we've received so far. And the thought being that we'll hold a public hearing at our next meeting for residents to make comment just on the county manager's proposed budget and the county general services tax rate. And then the first meeting in June, we would recommend that you tentatively adopt the county manager's budget and the county tax rate. And the county tax rate, just so you can remember, is the debt service and the county operating. Now, Cindy mentioned the schools process. In the general statutes, the schools have until May 15th to give you their budget. Probably they will adopt their budget at their next meeting, which I believe is either tomorrow night or a week from tomorrow night. Is it tomorrow night? So I know at their finance committee, they talked about it and so forth. And then you have the remainder of May, June, and I have a more detailed calendar, but generally the process would work out that you have the rest of this month, then the remainder of June to kind of discuss the school's budget. We have built in a public hearing just on the school's budget. As part of that process, then you would adopt the budget and final schools tax We also have our statutorily required public hearing that we would work into that schedule, that's required by the general statutes to allow anybody to come and speak on the budget that wants to. And then you would adopt ultimately the schools tax rate, which is the current operating and pay-go capital. What is part of this process that's new this year that we don't really have a block for is the recommendation, we'll talk a little bit about it more in detail in a few minutes, is the recommendation to break the EMS and fire tax rate out as a separate tax rate. For our purposes, we were kind of talking about that in conjunction with the county operations tax at the same time. If you remember going back to our last meeting we did a work session on fire funding and gave us some direction at that point. So the budget includes the fruition of that direction going forward. What we'd like to do is start with several principles as the basis of our budget development. Fiscal sustainability is always top. Whatever budget we give you, we want to be sure that it's sustainable into the future, and I have some forecasting and modeling to show you how that works. Transparency. We put a lot of effort into our document to be sure that it's transparent, kind of explains what's going on in the organization, reflects the changes on a micro level in the individual departments, talks about personnel changes, all those things. So as you're reading it, I believe the document is somewhere between 600 and 700 pages at this point, but that's all useful information for the residents depending upon the specific area you want to look at. And the way the document's been designed is to look at each individual tab separate from the rest of the book. So you will see some repetitive information in different places, but that's so that it's web-friendly, user-friendly. You don't have to download the entire document and fish through it. You can download one section and kind of see that, how it plays out. Stewardship, we always want to be good stewards of the public dollar. Responsiveness, meaning we are changing our service recommendations based on the changing needs in the community and kind of where the community is going and what we're seeing as staff, what you're telling us as commission and so forth. And then balance. Balance in two ways. Obviously the budget has to be balanced, that's required, but balance in our service delivery. What we don't want to have is a budget that's totally weighted toward one service area to the detriment of all the others. And that philosophy is kind of what's ingrained in the bifurcated process, is that the chunks that we're talking about in this case, the county services and the schools, they're so large and so important on their own that they should be talked about individually and not mixed together or commingled. So with that in mind, kind of review, we talked about bond elections, sustainable VFD funding, and the reval with the revenue neutral tax rates as our budget focus areas. We developed focus area working papers, went through those in the work session. On the bond election, that occurred on March 2nd. The direction was that the county will wait until a future date to do its projects. The SBCC projects will wait. The UCPS projects will wait for the discussion of the working group, the recommendation. But the one discussion kind of centered around, if you remember, that there needed to be a workforce plan in the county, that how the SBCC projects work in conjunction with UCPS projects, work in conjunction with even some of the county projects. That needed to be a little better thought out than where we were at the time in that discussion. And that included, if you remember back, the project package included some libraries, some sheriff, law enforcement, different projects like that. So the direction at that time was to go back and kind of work through those issues with an eye toward maybe having a 2018 bond election. If I remember correct, and absolutely, if I'm wrong, you can tell me, that it wasn't no, but it was wait, particularly in light of the current economic conditions and the tax rates and so forth.
I would make one statement, is the one item that did come off the list was land banking of parkland. Was the board removed, at least at this point in time, for no future consideration as a bond issue?
Other than that, we had about 10 projects that remained on there. The joint working group, which now, because the legislation has gone away, is up in the air as to where that goes. The joint working group on its April 15th meeting recommended that the maintenance portion of the CCDP go forward based on the funding that was included in the legislation, but that the bond project, the brick and mortar part of that, the bigger chunk, which is about 235 million, wait until McKibben's report comes out in the fall, the group reevaluate that with an eye toward a possible bond election. The discussion centered around the fact that in 2016, there's really 3 dates for bond election. There's probably, now it's the 1st of March, was originally going to be probably February. there is the May date, and then there's actually a November date. So the rush or the pressure to get to that bond election, that first bond election, was more of an artificial pressure felt by the group. And waiting to see what the McKibben study produces, at that point was kind of a discussion and seeing what the long-term needs, because the schools are going to ask McKibben to drill down and give us more refined, localized student growth estimates. And what they, based on what they've told us and what Dr. Webb said at the meeting, was that that big bubble that we all talked about coming through has really come through, and now what you're looking at is sustained localized growth. Well, and I think we want to wait and see what the statistics tell us and what McKibben's, the demographer's report tells us related to that before we go out and put out a bond election of some kind. In addition, that will include some discussion about what projects should be in that. And I know there's not complete agreement even within the working group. And I know Commissioner Helms sits on that group, Cindy sits on that group, and I do as well, as to what that project package should look like. So there's a lot of discussion still to be had around the school CIP, and we're waiting till the 15th to get what their request will be for next year. Sustainable VFD funding. We had our first work session on March 16th and then on April 20th. The final board direction received at that time was to freeze the VFD funding at the 15 levels, less capital and one-time items, with the only exception being the 2 departments on probation. The working group of 18 to 21, which I think is on your agenda tonight to appoint, will develop a funding model and do VFD contracts moving forward. That group's to include VFD tax districts, fee districts, municipalities, businesses, and residents, as well as break out the countywide VFD EMS tax from the general county operations tax, and that's included in your budget recommendation. Reval and revenue neutral tax rates, we had our work session on April 6th. We talked through the different concepts related to reval and kind of how it impacted the county. At that time, staff recommended and the board agreed that we would set the county tax rate based on the revenue neutral calculation less the growth component of that, as well as the schools tax at that time was to be based on legislation and our interpretation of the ADM. Since that time, and we haven't had a chance to come back and talk about that as a group, the legislation's gone away. So that discussion, I believe, now has to be had around what's presented on the 15th versus kind of what we presented to you originally. And then, as we mentioned, on April 23rd, 2015, the General Assembly eliminated the session law, and that kind of put us back into our classic process where the schools will make a request, and then you will have to deliberate that. We're required by general statutes to include in your document, for comparison purposes only, there's no real legal ramification other than it's there to demonstrate what that calculation looks like as far as revenue neutral. So if you remember back, there's 7 parts to that calculation. The 2014 tax levy, the 15 rate, what it would take to provide a yield of that same revenue number. So the new tax rate before growth, in this case, was 3212. Then the calculation requires you to add the growth rate, which is the average growth rate since the last reval, which was about 1.4%. So that revenue neutral tax rate was about 32.5 cents. This calculation was done before we split out EMS and fire. It has to be done that way because it was included last year, and we'd only be able to make proxy assumptions based on last year. So we split it out after the fact, and that's kind of what you'll see. This is the school's yield calculation, and if you remember back, under what was the session law, that tax rate would have been about 46.45. And here's all the different iterations, same on the schools. Without the growth rate, the revenue neutral rate is about 47.7. With the growth rate, it's about 48.37.
That's only based on information you have now and not what their proposed budget is.
Right, this is just the revenue neutral calculation. So this is a total revenue side calculation. This has nothing to do with the school's request.
Okay.
We're required, though, by general statute to show you what the tax rate would be under the revenue neutral calculation. And so we feel obligated to show it to you. But this doesn't at all say anything about what you're going to actually adopt for the schools. This is just a comparative purpose calculation. And that's because we do have it split out. So we have to show you both parts. So the proposed tax rates going into next year, you're looking at 28.82 for county operations, and then countywide fire and EMS tax of about 311. And that's 31.93. So that comes in just a little higher, or a little lower than the 32.12. And that what that amounts to is really the part of the VFD funding that was in prior years for one-time items. Remember, the direction was to take out one-time items and those increases. And when we did that, we were able to trim back the fire tax rate a little bit. And that's where you see that difference between 32.12, sorry, going the wrong way, 32.12 and the 31.93. It's not much, it's 0.2% or 0.2 penny difference. But that's really where the difference is. The recommended schools tax rate will have to be determined after the 15th when you deliberate on their budget. So we didn't include that in here. We just wanted to be sure you see what the total countywide tax rate for comparative purposes. This would have been the 36.4 from last year. That's the comparative tax rate, 31.93. Our strategic planning and plan of work, we're kind of in a transitional phase at this point. If you remember, we've done a lot of work around plan of work in the past, and that's not going away, but right now staff's focused on working on the strategic plan in preparation for the initiatives that come out of that and working through our process. And usually the way that would work is through November, we would be working on the plan of work, strategic initiatives, and so forth. And that's about the same time that those processes could be included in the budget for the following year. So if we were going to include the strategic planning steps in this year's budget, the initiatives, they would have had to have been done this time last year because the departments have started work in November on their budgets. The projections indicators kind of kick off in hardcore that budget process, starting again in January. Into May, we're developing, and then that's where we are right now is the public presentation of the budget and the outcome for public deliberation. And then the process kind of ends in October where we get our annual financial reports and our statements done to kind of tell us how we performed and how we did. And at that point, we kind of start the cycle all over again. And I think it's important to kind of understand because this is the rhythm, if you will, of the process that we go through every year, in that we kind of start with these strategic initiatives, and to be able to get them in the budget for this time of year, we really kind of need to have an idea of what those are going to be or have a good handle on those going into the budget process, because there's a lot of work that goes into this document and into the budget. There's probably over 50 people that touch this and work on it in departments and out there in the staff. So as we kind of work through our process now, I know Michelle, it's one of the top things on her list is to work on a strategic plan. The work we do on the strategic plan over the summer will then become part of next year's budget process moving forward. And of course, we have our monthly management reports that we do on the financial aspects of it and so forth. Again, November 3rd, the commission kind of gave us or approved 5 really key objectives: public safety, community consensus, economic development, sustainability, and organizational strengthening. The service areas are working through the initiatives to go with those right now. And I just wanted to remind you of our mission statement. This is also in the document. Through continuity of leadership and direction and built upon consensus of the community, we identify and implement strategies, programs, and services necessary to promote and sustain the quality of life and lifestyles unique to Union County. So this becomes the foundation at this point of the entire budget document, along with those principles we talked about: sustainability, balance, and those other things. These kind of form the foundation as we move forward for what we're putting together for you in conjunction with the direction you've given us on a micro basis. So where does the county funding come from? And again, this is gross funds, so this is all the entire county's total budget. The largest chunk comes through ad valorem taxes, about 53%. This is all the ad valorem taxes, which would include the fire districts, ad valorems, the counties, and the schools. You have a pretty significant chunk of local option sales tax, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes of where that goes. You have other funding sources, which could include fund balance usage and different things like that, interfund transfers, internal service funds. These are our IT, fleet, health insurance. These are the businesses that service county departments. Those are really more internal transfers and gross up the budget a little bit. Other revenue, primarily, that is our lease with the hospital. Investment income is obviously the interest we make on our investments. Enterprise charges for service, mostly, if not all, related to our water wastewater utility, a little bit of solid waste. That's the enterprise side. Non-enterprise charges for services are those things in the general fund, which we do, Cane Creek, maps, those kinds of things. State grants will make up about 2%. Federal grants, most of those come into the Department of Human Services. And our restricted intergovernmental revenue also largely in human services, as well as our sheriff's department. And unrestricted intergovernmental revenue, very little. That is money we get for different services we provide that is not necessarily restricted to a use. Some of the highlights countywide, our revenues are down by about 1.27%, about $4.5 million. Our ad valorem taxes are down by about 1.65%, or $3.1 million. And that's for a variety of reasons. Again, this is across the entire county. What we'll see when we get the VFD funding, some of the VFD tax rates came down because of sales tax and the growth in sales tax, and kind of holding them level on the funding side. Speaking of sales tax, we're estimating it to be up about 14.5% over our budget for 2015. That is up, we're estimating to be up by the end of the year by about 6.8%. So we're seeing about $1 million, $1.5 million growth over budget within this year. And we're seeing kind of unparalleled sales tax growth, but we know it's an upward trend that can't continue upward forever. So we're seeing healthy growth this year. And then next year we estimated about a 5.5%, 6% growth. So that's kind of how you get to that 14, budget over budget, it's about 14.5%. But when you compare year-end projection to next year, it's about 5.5%, 6% growth, 7% in that neighborhood. Enterprise charges for services are up about 11.66%. That's $4.4 million. That's due to two things. Really what you're seeing is growth in usage on water. We're seeing that kind of bounce back. And then also you have a 6.5% rate increase budgeted in water as well. So that increase generates about generates about $4.4 million. Non-enterprise charges for services are down about 2%. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in the general fund. But that's really because we lowered some of our rates in certain rate classes in certain areas around the county, particularly in Parks and Recreation. What we were trying to do is stimulate use by lowering the rates, and I believe the Parks Advisory Board is the ones that recommended that ultimately. Investment income's up by about 4.27%. Sounds like a large growth. It's only about $100,000 across the county. The internal service fund charges are up by about 5.5%, about $1.5 million, and that is largely due to our separation allowance requirements, as well as we have a phone system that we fully implemented this year, fleet charges, and some other areas. Like I said, those are kind of internal, like we said, internal to the organization. Our planned use of fund balance is about $2.6 million, and right now it's important to note that while we don't have the schools request, what we have done is we have planned to use your rate smoothing reserve. If you remember last year, we set the tax rate for schools at 45.5, and that generated extra income into the schools fund. So this year what we recommend to you, no matter what you do, at some point, you can have that reserve for rate smoothing to help you reduce that tax rate or to use for other purposes. We've made the assumption in the initial proposed budget, because we needed to have something plugged in, that you'd go ahead and use that rate reserve. So 1.7 of that 2.6 million deals with that rate smoothing reserve. There's about $450,000 of fund balance usage in the water fund, the solid waste fund. The rest of it comes from the 911 fund, the dental fund, the property casualty fund, are little pieces that we didn't want to raise. We didn't raise our health insurance rates, we didn't raise our dental rates, so we're using a little bit of the fund balances there. There is no use in the general fund of fund balance this year recommended, which I think is a positive thing, because that demonstrates that we're continuing to kind of have an ongoing sustainable budget, not relying on that fund balance to make the operating budget work. Where does it go? This is kind of the other side of that equation. Then when you have revenue, then where does it go expenditure-wise? And this is again county-wide. About 44% of the total county's budget, $153 million, give or take, is schools, and that includes debt service, what we pay to maintain their admin building, because we pay to maintain it, plus their original projected operations, our current expense, and their capital. This will all change based on kind of what they propose and what you decide. So this is an initial plug of what you had told us at our last meeting, on the meeting on tax rates, to plug in. Administrative services, which is my shop, about 1%. Board of Elections doesn't even come up to a whole percent. Community partners, this would include SBCC. This includes all of your community partners that are out there, the VFDs, economic development, and so forth. And we'll talk more about community partners at the end. We have a slide that breaks them all out for you. Community services, which is parks and recreation, soil and water conservation, the Ag Center, libraries, that group. Emergency services, which encompasses your 911, the VFD, all of the VFDs, and all EMS, all those components are captured because this is the gross level budget. General County Administration, this is everyone that doesn't necessarily have a home in another service area, tax, legal, the manager's office, the commission's budget, and so forth. Growth Management, that's your planning unit, as well as your inspectors. Human Services, that's DSS. Transportation, nutrition for the elderly, the health department, the veterans. Public Works, that's your water, wastewater, solid waste, stormwater, all those groups. Register of Deeds, and then of course the Sheriff's Office. And again, this is kind of, if you looked at it, this is by service area, if you look at it by where our funding goes. And I point this out because there's a couple of things about this that when rating agencies kind of judge how the county is, one of the metrics they use, how much do we spend on debt service and where does all of our money go? What you would expect to see in an organization, a governmental organization, is that employee compensation, employee benefits, in this case represent about 21%, you would expect to see that much higher. Because when you think about what we do as a county, we're personnel intensive. A lot of what we do is based on the people and the employees. But Union County is a little different because the largest part of our budget, 32%, goes out through contracts, grants, and subsidies. And that represents really what you pay to your schools through your funding of the current expense, the capital, and so forth. Includes that we contract out for EMS, we contract for VFDs, all those are included in there. So the biggest chunk of our budget is actually outsourced to those external groups. And then you can see debt service is the next biggest chunk, the third biggest chunk at 15%, which is a positive because debt service, while it drives in the general fund largely, it doesn't drive us countywide. Operating costs make up about 21%, and those are just the cost of, largely the cost in public works of chemicals and operating contracts, professional services, and throughout the organization for those other operating accounts. And then of course, as you can see interfund transfers, that's moving the money back and forth between the funds to cover internal services and those kinds of things. Expenditure highlights. Our employee compensation is up, and employee compensation and benefits up by about 6.1%. And what's driving that is, countywide, we budgeted for a 3% pull for merit increases. And we say a 3% pull because not every employee will get 3%. It's based on their performance evaluation. It's a range that will ultimately be decided and weighted based on a complicated formula that Mark works up in his shop. Everybody gets evaluated on performance, and then they are allocated a specific dollar amount. So nobody gets like a 2% pay increase. Everybody gets a fixed dollar amount based on the mid-level of their pay range and their score on their merit evaluation. The other part of that is about just under, right around $500,000 for the second year of the sheriff's deputy pay increases. If you remember back, we started a 3-year program to increase the sheriff's deputies' pay. This is included in there. There's about 20 positions recommended, which will show up in this number countywide, and I'll walk through each of those in just a few minutes. And there's also a 3% move of the ranges to try to keep us competitive, or at least kind of competitive in the market, which is 3% move on the bottom, 3% move on the top. That helps us hire new employees. So all of that gets factored in. In addition, you had some increases in your OPEB costs, increases in other insurance from the perspective of the separation allowance and those different things. Because those are actuarially driven and driven by outside the organization. So your total employee compensation and benefits are up about $4.4 million. Operating expenditures are up by about $4.5 million, about 3.1. Our other budgetary accounts are down significantly, and that's due to one-time items from last year, things that we didn't do again. Interfund transfers are significantly down, And that's because this year we're not transferring, if you remember, we did an interfund transfer of about $7 million for the human services building. We have $2 million that we put in for the firing range. So you can see that's down significantly from last year. Our capital outlay in total is down by 21%, and that is not capital projects, but capital purchases, so that's vehicles and those kinds of things. And our debt service is down by about 2.2%, and that's a combination of two things. It's the refundings we've done are saving us money, and also we've paid off a little bit, so our payment's going down. We have a declining debt schedule, so every year we pay off a little bit, so we should see a decline in that every year.
Jeff,
Yes, sir.
employee compensation, what did we do last year?
It's the same, we did 3% last year.
This is what we've done, will be our third year.
And it's always been merit-based, so it's not a COLA. Everybody, I believe, if you're below competent and effective, then
2 years in a row.
2 years in a row, then you don't get anything. So it's all based on merit, and right now everybody's doing their evaluations, and that pot will be divvied up equally across the organization, based on your score.
Jeff, you mentioned the OPEB, is that just what we owe, or I think we were trying to bring it down? I know we contributed some a year or two ago or something to try to bring it down.
2 or 3 years ago, we took some of our fund balance and we paid it against some exposure that we had in our OPEB account. The last 2 years, we have not moved any money into
We
OPEB.
covered our required contribution.
Right, but we're not going back
buying down.
and drawing down that balance that we have in that
That's the
account.
question.
Right. So what, in our discussions, one of the things we talked about is if there is additional sales tax money and those kinds of things, one of the options you'll have is to try to buy down some of that liability. Because OPEB is a liability that sits out there, and we have to show it on our books. But you can buy it down by making increased contributions to it, and that's a long-term impact, and that's a very long game to play, but it's a very beneficial game because it reduces the long-term liabilities of the organization. So that we are making our actuarially required contribution and then a little bit more, and that's what's gone up because we've added employees as you go up in salary, and as your cost, your payrolls go up, and as your employee base gets a little younger as well, we're seeing a little bit of the top end roll off in the organization, then that liability grows because you have a longer window that you're paying for.
What is our exposure on that?
Do you remember?
I want to say 40, 50 million, but I could be wrong.
That's
It's
what I'm thinking.
somewhere in
It's
that
somewhere in that
neighborhood.
neighborhood. It's in the CAFR, and I'll be happy to pull that page for you and send it to you. But it's, we get it done every year, or every other year as an actuary, and they tell us what our liability is. And there's pros and cons to trying to pay it all off, but you want to try to reduce it as much as possible.
And it's one of the things that, depending upon where we end up after our audit is done, that we'll discuss with you, because I think it does help with our rating agencies, is the fact that they do see that as a more fiscally sustainable action upon the by the Board of County Commissioners as to try to reduce those liabilities.
And we did see some benefit. So last year, the year before, where the commission made some changes in the post-employment benefits and changed
2 years ago.
You kind of changed the eligibility and kind of how that works. So we saw some benefit of that liability dropped a little bit. And when we say OPEB, what we mean is other post-employment benefits, meaning health insurance for that window that the county has to pay for insurance between when you retire and when you hit Medicare or Medicaid. I can't remember which one of the two that you had when you
Medicare.
Medicare, thank you.
For those of us who are closer to it.
I'm not expecting to be there when I retire, so that helps us cover that cost of the post-employment benefits. So the richer you make your benefits at that point, the legacy cost is kind of what we're looking at. And if you remember back kind of in the financial crisis, that was one of the discussions, was big corporations and the legacy cost of benefits and how that impacted the corporate side of the world. And a few years ago, GASB started making us show that for the government side as well. So it is beneficial for us to buy that down. But that's one of the big costs in employee compensation and benefits that kind of grew over the last year. Is that all the questions? Sorry, we probably took a little detour there. FTE summary. As you can see, your largest department is your human services department, about 335 employees. The next is going to be the sheriff's department, and so forth. Our community partners, you have one employee, and that's
DWI court.
That's what it was. Drew a blank, sorry. The DWI court. And where those increases are, Board of Elections, we'll tell you a little more detail about this, but the Board of Elections, because of the number of elections coming up, they had to staff up with part-timers. I believe we counted and there was 4 elections coming up if you get the November primary or the November bond election that the governor's asked for. You could have up to 4 elections, almost 5 if you have runoffs in that conversation. I believe it's 5. Community services, about just under 2 FTE, and that's a conversion, largely conversions of state funded to local funded or part-timers to full-timers. Human services, a net increase of about 5.5. Public works, a net increase of 5.8. And the sheriff's office, a net increase of 2.6. And we'll go into more detail in the general fund about those. So, talk about the general fund and sustainability. One of the things we always try to do for you is, we started the whole process with the projections and the fund projections. Because remember, number 1 on our list of principles is sustainability. So what we want to bring to you is a budget that meets that requirement, that's fiscally sustainable. And I'm happy to say that based on where we are now, the service package we have in front of you, we believe what you have is a sustainable budget. And this model just kind of proves that out. You've seen this before, but I'll just go through it real quick. In 2015, this is based on revised budget, so this is all your budget actions and transfers through March. We didn't, because we cut off of March and April, it's kind of right about the same time we were finishing the document. We weren't able to make those changes, but it's not materially different. From a budget perspective, 11.8 million use of fund balance in the general fund. That's $7 million for the human services building, $2 million for the sheriff's firing range. There's also some other funding in there, but it's largely those two. You had your carry forward from last year for encumbered contracts and those components, which was about $2.5 million. So our proposed budget, about $153.4 million. That's why you see it exactly balanced, 0 right here. Projected into next year, and again, we project on a line item basis. So we projected about 1.1% growth on ad valorem. We projected about 4% sales tax growth. We've projected employee costs depending upon healthcare and those kinds of things. 3% on compensation, 5 to 7% on health insurance and all the different insurances. And based on what we know in our capital program and so forth, we think next year's budget will be about 158.6. And just to kind of give you an idea, when I go back and I compare the proposed against where we modeled it at, on the expenditure side, we're about 1 to 1.5% difference, and on the revenue side, we're right at 1% difference. So where we were at in January as to where we are now, we're real close. We're not far out of whack. Particularly then when you take the VFD discussion, kind of how that went, we're right on top of where we thought we would be. So that's good news. It played out kind of how we expected. So with that in mind then, keeping in mind this works, negatives are positive, positives are negatives. So this, anytime you have a positive number down here, means that you don't have enough revenue to cover your operations. But that's okay because this is a projection. We believe we have a sensitivity of about plus or minus 3%. So this number right here, as long as you are at 3% of your total budget, then you're within working room. Means that our revenue projections aren't going to be exactly what we think they are. Our estimations on expenditures and that far into the future aren't going to be exactly where we think they are. So that kind of gives us that sensitivity to that variance that we talk about. So based on this being less than 1.5 going into the future and 185 here, we believe that we are real close to being right on balance. And one thing we could do is recommend shaving the tax rate up and down to make this. But we think, given your tax rate where it's at, and we're recommending it without major changes in the way we budget and the way we provide services, that the 2882 will be sufficient and sustainable through this window. And that's, again, all else being equal, that's borne out by what our projections tell us. And then in these years, right here, because debt's coming down, you can see how that debt drops significantly, there's a little bit of capacity in those future years. And again, those are 4 or 5 years out. Things will certainly change between now and then, and every year when we do our projections, we'll tweak that just a little bit. But all of that is to tell you, and I think the question was asked during our discussion on tax rate is, will the 2882 or the 3212 at that time be sufficient for the future. Well, you have to come back next year for a tax rate increase. And what we're telling you from this modeling, we believe for the general fund portion that 2882 is sufficient for the window that we're working in right now. Of course, that can always change based on changes in service, changes in different things, economy and so forth. But we feel pretty confident that, at least for the next few years, that's a sustainable approach. And if you remember back, this is just we recast the numbers based on our modeling from January. Are there any questions? Okay. So the general fund, it's kind of a mirror of where it comes from on the larger scale. Ad valorem represents about 45% of our total, the general fund. And again, the general fund represents the county operations, excluding EMS, excluding fire, and excluding schools. Local option sales tax, about $34.5 million. That's our next biggest revenue. Under the restricted governmental revenues, if you took our grants, federal grants, state grants, restricted, it gets to be pretty significant. And we'll see in just a second when we look at the net, what we call our net takers table, or our net allocation of the tax rate, that the biggest chunk of that funding from the state and intergovernmental revenue and federal revenue goes to DHS and the Sheriff's Department. And I think that's really important to talk about because about half of that funding for DHS comes through those resources, not through local tax rates. What does the revenue look like in the general fund? About $153.4 million. That's down from last year by about $16.5 million. But you have to take into consideration when you're comparing year over year that we did remove the EMS and the fire costs and those tax rates out from this year. So it's not exactly the most comparative. But if you were to look at, for instance, ad valorem, we're down about 2.7%, 2.8% on an adjusted rate. That's the adjusted tax rate. If you had taken out EMS and fire from last year and you took out EMS and fire from this year, that's really where we're at. And what that amounts to is that we took out EMS after their increase in their costs. And I'll show you that in a couple of minutes. Fire we backed out on before because we already had that planned in, but then after our conversations when we took EMS out, we didn't take it out of the prior year at the prior year's amount and then add it back at the new year amount. We went ahead and backed it out completely at their new year. So that generated, instead of being roughly even, that generated a loss of about 2.7%, 2.8% of the general fund. Prior year collections are down by about 76%. And you hear us a lot of times, we talked about, particularly when we had our tax rate conversation, that we're required to estimate based on the last year's actual collection rate. As we kind of take that rate up, we run out of things to collect. So in this conversations with Van and going into next year with the change in the motor vehicle tax and how that's collected, as well as the change in the ad valorem, or the way we collect ad valorem on property, we kind of hit terminal velocity. We've hit that year where Van thinks we're at our tax office thinks that we're kind of at the point where we have collected as much of that back or non-current tax as we can get. So we kind of hit that brick wall, if you will. That's down significantly, so $1.8 million down. And then because of that, we're also going to see a decline in ad valorem interest, which is the late penalties. So we've collected about as much as we're going to get from prior years. And I don't anticipate that that'll continue to grow over time. Unrestricted local option sales tax. If you remember back, a portion of our sales tax has to go to debt, is required by law. The portion that non-restricted or that unrestricted portion is up about 14.7%, pretty much what we saw countywide. Other taxes and licenses are up about $75,000. Our intergovernmental revenues are down. Our state and federal grants are up slightly. That deals more with human services and the reimbursement for temporary employees and the things that are going on there than it does anything else. Our non-enterprise charges for services are down just in the general fund by about $700,000. And again, that's from a couple of things. That is also our permitting revenue. So we are seeing kind of a decline in our permitting revenue and our expected permitting revenue, and also a decline in what our fee revenue is at our parks in those areas. The decline in the parks is due to a lowering of the rate. The decline in the permitting is due to we're trailing off on our permits, whereas we kind of saw a peak here in 15, latter 14 and 15. We're going down from that peak. In fact, we're probably a little high on our estimate at 15. because we kind of hit that peak mid-year versus kind of having it come in the end. And again, our investment income is up pretty significant, but it's only about $500,000 in total. And our total other revenues are down $163,000. And other revenues include sale of assets, liquidated vehicles, those kinds of things. And those ebb and flow every year based on the assets we dispose of. So where does it go? Again, you can see employee compensation. This is more about getting into the neighborhood where I'd expected. 41% of your general fund budget goes to employees, employee compensation. 28% goes to debt service. The operations, about 22%, about 34 million, 34.8, almost 35 million. Your capital outlay, and so forth. Probably a better way to look at it is, where are we spending our dollars from a departmental perspective? Because that doesn't tell you a whole lot exactly where. It tells you by type kind of how we're spending it. But this kind of tells you the services you're providing for it. 29% of the general fund for schools and debt service. And again, that includes the debt service plus the operating cost of their facility. Your human services, about 42.5 million. That's 27% of your total budget. The next largest chunk is the Sheriff's Department. There he is, at about almost 28 million, about 18%. Then you kind of go around the wheel. 1% for administrative services, kind of what we saw countywide. Board of Elections. Our community partners are pretty significant, and we'll show that in a moment again. Community services, about 5%. Emergency services is about 4%. This would include the general fund subsidy for the VFDs. Our general county administration, again, that's kind of that leftover group that doesn't particularly have a service area at home. So that's commission, manager's office, tax, legal, a whole handful, or a host of other departments, and so forth. Then you have a little bit of public works, and that's just based on reimbursement and registry of deeds. Probably this is one of the tables I think is most valuable because it answers the question of where does your tax dollar go? What we talked about total budget. This is kind of where it goes, where all of your dollars go, including sales taxes, fees, and all the other stuff. But then when you're talking about tax dollars, where do the tax dollars go? We refer to this as the net takers table. Not that any of these departments have any less of a mission than anyone else, but takers from the perspective of that we have takers and givers, and those, when you see a negative rate, that means they're contributing back to the organization and reducing tax dollars. Where you see a positive tax rate, they're using tax dollars as an offset. So when you look at, and you kind of walk down through it, your biggest area that you're spending is in the sheriff's office, almost 11 cents on sheriff services. But I think it's important to note, you have about 3.4 cents dedicated to UCPS, debt service, and facilities charges. And that largely is offset because we allocate, in this discussion, we allocate all of your sales taxes to the schools. Not a single dollar of sales tax outside of that goes anywhere else but to schools' debt at this point. And that's a policy decision, that's not by law, but that's a policy decision that the board made last year in its budget, and we continue that process this year. And again, remember I told you, human services, if you look at intergovernmental revenue, about just a little under half their budget, almost $21 million comes from that intergovernmental revenue, and that includes the restricted governmental revenue and those other things, so they can't spend that outside of those services that they get those for. Then you have about charges for service, about 3.4 million in the human services. So your human services after the sheriff's office, about 7.8 cents there. And then it's really beyond those three large ones. You have your community service, about 3.2 cents. I will point out growth management, based on the notion that you really want to try to have your permitting revenue and those things kind of balance out those inspections programs and so forth. That's 3/100ths of a cent. So it's right on balanced against its revenues, charges for service against its operating costs. They take about they give about $67,000 back to the general fund, which you could estimate that's the cost of their overhead, if you will. We don't treat them like an enterprise, but you could. And then you see human service. I've already talked about human services. So you kind of see the others there. Administrative service about 0.63 cents, Board of Elections, and so forth. But this kind of really gives you an idea, particularly because we do break out on the tax bill and recommended for next year, be it fire, EMS, and then schools. This is the rest of that breakdown. We're certainly not suggesting you break down the tax bill by all of these, but it does answer that question, because we always do get why break out schools, why break out fire, because we think it's important to understand kind of where your tax dollars go. General fund expenditure highlights, kind of the same that are driving the organization. Employee compensation's up by about 5.8%. We'll walk through the new positions specifically in just a second, but again, that's 3% compensation pull. That's the 3% move on the pay ranges and so forth in some new positions. Employee benefits are up for all the same reasons. And we talked about OPEB and cost of insurance, plus the cost of the benefits costs related to pay increases and so forth. Operating costs are up about 3.9%, and that's just growth and increase some professional services. Largely, the biggest chunk of that comes in human services because of an increase due to NC Fast. If you remember back a couple of agendas, actually twice this year, you've added contract positions to human services, and that's the cost. That's where the cost of those positions show up in the budget. And that, if I remember right, it's about $900,000, give or take, for those 20 positions. Your capital outlay is up just slightly. Grants, contracts, and subsidies down 54.4%. Again, that's largely because we took out EMS and the fire out of this equation. Debt service is down. That's due to payoff plus our refinancing. Interdepartmental charges are down. And interfund transfers are down significantly. And that's, again, because we have one-time transfers in 2015 we're not going to have next year. At least we don't at this point. And again, our other budgetary accounts are down. So your largest FTE, again, the sheriff, human services. This is where the general fund, all of your FTE go. But let's talk about real quick kind of where your growth, your total increases are in the general fund. You had your board of elections. Those are 4.96. That's part-time FTEs to cover elections, poll workers, and so forth. Your community service increase was about almost 2. That's 1 FTE for the cooperative extension secretary. That position was funded by the state. They're no longer going to fund it. But that would leave them with 1 admin support position out there to cover all the extension agents and all that goes on out there. So we're recommending, although we haven't announced the planning policy, we recommend that you would go ahead and pick up that funding, because we don't believe they could even cover the front door with the staffing level if you took that position out of the equation. They do require that level of administrative support for that number of agents and so forth. Just under half the position, office support for Cane Creek. What they're doing right now is they're kind of covering their weekend shifts with other part-timers and rangers, and we really want your rangers out in the park, being sure everybody's operating safely and doing the things they're supposed to do in the park. So what we're recommending is that you would add about half a part-time position to pick up weekends out at the park, and then a 0.52 FTE increase from a part-time to full-time conversion for the soil conservation for an education specialist. And again, this is to increase the programming that soil conservation is doing. And they feel like they have enough capacity, and this is part of their mandated service. And we're just we're growing that program more to fill their mandate than we are just to grow and increase demand.
And this was an area that I think during the reduction in force had 3 personnel, and it was reduced down to 1. Last year we added half a position, and this year we're recommending we add the other half of that position.
Human services.
Let's wait,
Oh,
just a second. On the Cane Creek,
Yes, sir.
so we reduced the fees at the park. We're losing more money. And now we're gonna increase the staff at the park.
But I don't know that we're really losing money, and
Okay.
this is kind of my philosophy when we went through and looked at the whole fee restructuring. What we were hearing from so many of our patrons was, I need to pay to get through the door. I need to pay to play putt-putt golf. I need to pay to fish. I need to pay to swim. I need to pay to walk the trails. And so a lot of the families where this was, I mean, it's a function that is paid by your general taxpayers' dollars. A lot of families were saying, it is no longer an affordable amenity for me. So I think the overall fees, based upon the estimates, I think initially will go down, but I think what you're going to see is you're going to have more visitors come to the park. So I don't know that they're
Have you
as,
seen an increase in usage since we reduced those fees?
I can't tell you for sure if we have or have not.
I think it just went into effect.
When?
It's been in effect only about 2 months, 3 months.
Is that all?
Yeah, because it's free in the winter.
Oh, okay,
Right.
right, okay.
So I think January and February are free, if I remember right.
Yep.
So somebody's right. I think we see it drop off this year, but you may in future years see that pick back up. But it's really hard to know. We had a long conversation about this when we did our budget meetings, because that's the same question. Why we're seeing reduced revenues, why are you trying to now add staff out there? It's a long game strategy to try to increase usage, and you'll pick up revenue through the increased usage. We're just so early now in the way we have to budget for it. It's really an unknown, and I think we'll make changes in the future based on that usage one way or the other. So it's kind of an experiment to see exactly how it's going to play out.
And part of the issue was that we were taking a park ranger who should be out in the park and having him sit in the office on the weekends to take reservations, to do all of that. And to me, it makes a lot more sense at a lower pay rate and a half-time temporary or permanent part-time position to have them fulfill that function versus one of our park rangers.
So this will be part-time supplemental type?
Right.
Have we thought about, so that person's gonna take reservations for the camping sites, or?
They do everything. They take money as people come into the park. They fulfill all of those administrative functions on the weekends.
That's really, the goal is really to free up the park ranger to allow the park ranger to go out. And the hours in the FTE, it's not done by slots, it's done by hours. So it could be 2 people
Right.
filling, a college student, or there could be any number of ways to fill that. But it's really just the additional hours and the money to pay for those hours. The human services, and when you go back and you kind of look what we did last year, what we've done this year, we really tried to focus in on human services and try to supplement the staffing there to kind of bring up, particularly in social services. If you remember back when we looked at our demand for services indicators, that social services is one of the areas we were struggling in, that our caseloads were high and our volume was high. And we're really trying to reduce the cases per employee, per worker. So this year we're recommending 2 FTE for guardianship social workers, and these are in the adult protective services areas. 2 adult protective service social workers, 1 social worker for our IAT program, and then 1.5 FTE in our part-time driver FTEs. And this is to allow us to have early morning dispatch, so our the division director is not actually doing dispatch early every morning and staying late to do it as well. So this is really kind of a staffing issue we've had to work through. I will point out, when you add all those up, it's 6.48, but there was a 1 FTE decrease in a processing assistant in public health. And in the sheriff's office, we have a 2.5 FTE increase. There's a conversion of a full-time to a part-time, or part-time to a full-time position, administrative assistant. And the sheriff's office has done some reorg since Deputy Green's passing, that they feel this is a better way to approach some of the job duties that he had, as well as kind of reorganizing around that. Then an additional animal care specialist, going back to how they're euthanizing animals. This is requiring us to kind of add additional staffing because it's a more labor-intensive, employee-intensive process and more hands-on than it has been in the past. And then the sheriff's requested a crime scene investigator to add an additional position. So where does that leave us then at the end of the year? Based on the revised budget, this is kind of where you are with your fund balance appropriation. Keeping in mind that part of this assigned fund balance is $850,000 or $835,000 that the county has essentially provided to the school system on a temporary basis to purchase radios, and we're doing that radio partnership with them. And so part of that has come out of that funding that would normally be there. So we're down below your policy, or above your policy goal by about $468,000. Again, we know that sales taxes are performing a little better than anticipated. We've reached our collections estimates on ad valorem, so we'll see a little bit of a growth there. So you'll see a little bit of an increase in revenue above estimate, probably, assuming that some of those that we are under collecting kind of come back in. And then also we know that we're seeing a little bit of savings on the personnel side and some of the things that we would anticipate. So we'll expect to see that fund balance grow at the end of the year, but I don't believe it's going to be significant as it was last year, given last year's specific set of circumstances. So we're monitoring that. We will probably have some recommendations even maybe before the end of the year if we really believe we have significant increases coming in as to what to do with that. We have some options as far as buying down debt. OPEB, as we mentioned earlier, are some other things that you could do with that. Water and sewer fund, the block that you see here, and really why we show this is these are your currently adopted rate increases. We're in the second year of that, and these rate increases go into effect on July 1. The other thing you can see, and really the two big drivers that you have, we'll talk about this in a little more detail, are your debt service and your pay-go capital program going out over the years. But this is what your forecast of your projected water fund financial projections look like. To keep on track with the capital plan that you have in place and the operations and all the maintenance that needs to be done, this is the projected rate increases over time. Of course, when we get to 2017 and we start looking at 18, 19, 20 to do that next round, these numbers will change based on the changing conditions and how those funds are spent down over time. So I encourage you kind of really focus. This is where we're at right now. When we get to this discussion, those will change out into the future. So those are a little, 7.5%. That's not set in stone. You haven't adopted that at this point. You have, however, adopted these 3 rate increases going across there. Where does the funding come from in water? In our wastewater fund, as you can tell, 99% enterprise charges for services. That's why it stays in that fund. We don't transfer money out for just generally out of the water and sewer fund, general fund. We do charge some overhead charges, those kinds of things, interfund charges. But those are for services they take for the attorney's time and so forth. But we don't do it in outright transfer. Again, 6.5% rate increase on July 1. We're seeing, other than that, we're seeing some pretty healthy growth in our water usage. Where does it go? Operating costs is their biggest cost at this point. It's cost of chemicals, cost of contracts, those kinds of things. They kind of ebb and flow with usage. You have about 16% in debt service, about 19% in employees. Their capital outlay is about 2%. And you also, in this is their pay-go capital program, which is one of their biggest chunks. And I think a better way to look at capital, I'll cover that in just a second. But we have a better way to look at capital, so let's hold on to that thought. We're recommending a little bit of an increase, 5-position increase, or 4-position increase in FTE. Administrative assistant at the Ops Center. What goes on right now, when they open the Ops Center doors, they don't have there's no administrative help right now that the workers out there, the crew, have to provide for their own processing their POs and all their own AP processing and those kinds of things. So there really needs to be some admin support on site just to answer the phone and to be on site all the time. And right now they don't have that. And when we did the positions, and I'll say this about all these positions, we really focused on things that provide direct service to the public versus admin versus engineering and those other things. So you have utility crew leader, a utility mechanic, and a meter reader, and this is to do meter sets and resets and pulls and those kinds of things.
Well, we're starting the meter replacement program. Our meters are reaching their 10-year life.
This kind of got caught in the middle. I said the 4 FTE because we anticipate that before the end of the year, we'll come back and request the community relations manager for water and wastewater. And this is tied into the ordinance you'll adopt tonight and the increased education that goes along with that. And part of what's in the master plan and so forth that requires more public education on water usage and conservation. So we'll be recommending before the end of the year probably that this position be added, which for budget purposes, because it kind of got caught in this tight window of in between budgets, will be not new for next year, but new before the end of the year. So I wanted to be sure I highlighted that, and that's why it says FY15. Employee compensation's up for pretty much the same reasons.
Can I ask a question before you leave that
Sure.
part? Why would we not use some of our existing staff for that and just fund them half?
We're paying contracted services to do that right now.
You want it?
You're paying contracted services to do that right now through
The
your
community
engineering
relations
firms. To some degree, as it relates to the Norwood project, and Ed's back here, so if he can correct me if I get this wrong. As it relates to Norwood, right now, you are paying your engineering fees, engineering firms to do a lot of the community outreach that we are required to do as part of the environmental assessment that we'll be required to do as part of the permit, et cetera. So you have got a cost that you're already experiencing with respect to Norwood. The other piece is that as part of your water ordinance as it relates to conservation, we do absolutely, and I think in our briefings we mentioned this, we do absolutely no public information whatsoever. We don't do door hangers, we don't do any kind of public speaking, we don't do a speakers bureaus, we do nothing. And as part of going to a different watering scheme, as part of trying to ensure that individuals understand what the restrictions are, et cetera, we believe that it is more beneficial to have that person in-house than to kind of play hit and miss. And having come from a environment that was a utility about the same size as the utility we had someone full-time who worked on water conservation and educating our users as it related to the appropriate use of the system, how they could, different water saving devices they could use. And I will tell you that it is not a job that you splinter off between multiple staff members. It is a specific area of expertise.
You mentioned the meter change out. When does that take effect? When are we starting that?
It would be part of the FY16 fiscal years where we budgeted specific monies to start a routine change-out program. Obviously, we do change out as meters fail, or we do calibration. They're showing they're not up to speed, but this is getting into a program that recognizes we have a whole, we went to a new metering system about 8 years ago, 9 years ago.
Ed,
We
why
went to
don't
all-
you- Sorry. Why, and see you.
Fingers on that. About 8 years ago, the county went to an automatic meter reading system, and as part of that, we changed out probably about 80% of our meters at that time. So that wave of meters that was changed out 8, 9 years ago to about 25 to 30,000, I think it's about 28,000 meters, are starting to come of age. And this is to kick off a program specifically to start replacing those meters on an age schedule rather than just on a failure basis.
And what do we estimate the improved efficiency is going to be on the meters for the revenue?
You know, typically what you're seeing in a meter as it approaches 10 and goes beyond 10 years old, you start seeing efficiencies drop from 98, 99% down to 95, 94 and below. So we've done some preliminary testing to kind of validate that data, but that's what we're assuming is that we're at that age.
Okay. And if we're going into a new meter system, is it still going to be AMR?
Yeah, it's still AMR, but it is we're going to either Neptune or Vectron meters is what we standardized on those two to keep competition, but moving away from the old manufacturer we had.
Okay. Why do we need an additional utility reader then?
This is one person, essentially one full-time equivalent, just out there full-time changing out meters. We're looking at doing 10% of our meters each year at this time frame.
Is that the mechanic or the reader?
That's we call it's a utility. It's actually the title is utility tech. Utility meter tech is the actual job title. It's not a meter reader. It's a utility meter tech.
Okay.
Yeah.
So they'll be doing the change outs, but
Yes.
we'll be contracted.
This is the person physically going out there, pulling the old meter out, dropping the new one in.
Okay.
Is that the driver behind the 6.5 increase? What's the driver behind that 6.5? And then it goes to 7?
The rate increase is really driven, as Jeff was saying, primarily by our capital improvement program. So it's that 300 million 10-year capital improvement program that's driving our debt service, that's driving our rates.
Are we evaluating the increase in efficiencies on the collections or the revenue side from the meter reading versus that 6.5 increase?
We haven't plugged it into a rate model to see how much of an improvement that would make. So we're looking at water efficiency overall when we're doing our forecast, and we're assuming an ongoing efficiency, but we haven't tried to tweak it that finely.
So potentially we could eliminate that 6.5 or change it, modify it, lower it.
We could. I mean, as we were saying earlier, when we start moving forward into the next round of rate increases, we'll be reevaluating where our revenue stream is actually. This year, we're overperforming on revenue. For the last 2 years, last year we came in right on budget. This year, we're actually overperforming. Our revenue is doing really well. our expenses are holding flat. So as we follow those trends, we'll look at where that goes in the next year or two, we'll readjust the forecast and hopefully not have to go with these continued rate increases to the same extent.
And that was along the same lines. And my question, you had about a little over 11% growth rate and a 6.5% rate increase. What I've seen is your head count is just continually growing. And that's, you know, with that kind of, you still making additional, but you're having an additional, revenue's greater, but your overhead's getting higher.
Well, the revenue is up by
Yeah.
11.5%. Our operating expense is almost flat, and our personnel cost is up by about 4%.
Well, it's
4% plus the cost of living, plus the merit adjustment.
Yeah, there's a couple of components to that.
Yep.
So they're not growing as fast as the revenue is growing, and really what it boils down to, and I hate to jump ahead real quick, but, okay, so this is kind of what Ed was talking about. The growth in the budget that's gonna drive those rate increases is gonna be what we refer to as a capital lever. Meaning, the growth in a position here or there that we've really focused in the last couple of years on the service side, so those are people out in the field making sure the system operates correctly, is really this growth or the project package, this essentially $510 million project package over that master plan is gonna drive up to the point even where half of the total budget for water wastewater by the 2021 is gonna be debt service and PAYGO. And the light blue blocks in this case represent the PAYGO capital program, and the navy, or the dark turquoise or dark blue, represent the debt service. So you can see as that steady climb, that's really been driving, when we talked about the rate, as you can see here, the debt service goes 6, 10, 12, 17, 28, 34. That's driving your growth here. So you go 35 to 44, which is a 4 million, and then doubling your PAYGO from 4.8 to 8.5. Then you continue to grow those pieces out over to the future, and that's really what's driving this bottom line growth. So it's not the operational impact of those additional positions, because we have that conversation every year as to where are we growing and where is that money going. This is not the big driver. The 5% increase in compensation, even with your new positions, is only about $220,000. It really boils down to this capital program. As you can see, this is system INE, I used to call it R. This is an expansion, and what's the I stand for it? I can't remember it.
Improvements.
Improvements, there you go. Improvements and expansion, and then you have replacement and renewal. And these pieces are what's really driving your budget over time. And you can see that capital PAYGO program, this is what your PAYGO program represents, and this is your debt program. So it's really been this that's driving your cost in your water rates. It is not, it's not these pieces, because the sum total of all of these pieces are just under $1 million, or right around $1 million, and that includes the debt service changes and so forth. So this is what's really your big driver, and this is what we've seen as we continue to do this analysis over a year-over-year basis, is that because the county has an aggressive capital program, including the Adkin Water Supply Project, the 12 Mile Creek wastewater treatment plant improvements, some developer-funded projects, the Catawba River water treatment facility. These are driving your rates over time. So I understand what you're asking, and you're seeing, because you are seeing kind of incremental growth in staffing, but that's not really what's driving your rates. That's more driven because of the customers and the aging system and the need to have people out there working on the individual components versus we're growing staff over time to grow the department. What's really driving your system is the needed expansion in capital for replacement and ongoing debt service.
These are all revenue bonds?
These will all be revenue bonds.
Just to add to your specific question on growth in FTEs, one of the parameters we do track is the number of FTEs per 100 customers served. So we track that on a comparative basis year over year, and we're actually holding about steady for the last 4 years. So even though we're adding staff, we're significantly growing in our customer base, and we're actually still significantly below where we were in the early 2000s. So when we took the big hit along with the rest of the county in 2007, 2008, significantly dropped our staff, number of staff per customer dropped significantly. We've never come back even near that number from where we were prior to 2007. So we are cognizant of, we can't just grow staff, that it does have an impact. It's not significant to the rate impact, but it's obviously a cost. So we are cognizant of that, and we're trying to keep that in line with our growth in the system.
I hope I'm hearing wrong, but I think I heard what you said was that okay, are the current customers paying for repairs and upkeep of the current system, or are they paying also for expansion?
It's two pieces. Okay, the system R&R is done through your PAYGO program, so that's cash funded, and that's mainly water line replacement and current system replacement. They will in the future, and this is the intergenerational, we'll refer to as intergenerational equity, where the major expansion projects, and probably this is a better way to look at it, this top set of projects up here, this $470 million worth, will be funded largely through revenue bonds. Those revenue bonds will be then 20 or 25 years. So over the next 20 or 25 years, that customer base will pay that debt service. These projects down below, rehab and renewal, these projects are on the existing system and keeping the existing system functioning. These are paid every year by all the water customers, regardless. So this is essentially current usage and paid for by current customers. This will be paid for incrementally by future customers over time.
So the increases, the 6.5 increases over the next, that's not for future growth of the system, it's for repairing the system to maintain it for the current customers.
It's for both. Because there's a certain assumption made when we're talking about the projections that generate, sorry, I'm kind of flipping around now, so I apologize.
And I guess the reason I'm asking, if it is for increasing the system, why would we not increase the tap home fees or the impact fees that are paid by?
We already have done that.
We've done that. Part of what's in your bond covenant is those connection fees have to go toward certain projects, and we do that. But that alone, those are kind of one-time revenues, and you kind of price yourself out of the market if you charged every customer what it costs them proportionally to cover those future projects. So what we do is we fund those through the revenue bonds, and through the revenue bonds, then over the life of that use of that customer, of that tap, they're paying for that over time instead of that one-time initial coverage. But you kind of do it because all of these projects that we go back, flip around, these projects aren't just for system expansion. These projects are to cover the existing customers as well, and to ensure the system's capacity so that all customers in the water system. You have to look at it as an entire water system, and everybody that joins onto it pays a proportional share of that. Not just existing and future customers. It has to be shared across the entire system because every gallon of water is a shared gallon of water, essentially from a rate perspective. Does that kind of make sense, Commissioner?
Why would you include developer-funded projects in your, and I can understand you plan on them doing it, but why would it be in your total?
There's a very specific reason for doing that. It's actually in our water and sewer extension ordinance. We specifically reference capital projects defined in our CIP that developers have to reimburse the cost for. So we need to show it in our CIP to be in conformance with our water and sewer line extension ordinance, so that they're specifically defined and shown. But you're right, the revenue is all coming from the developer to pay for those.
Right. There's a flip side, $38 million, or what is it, I'm sorry, developer funded, yeah, $38.4 million. There's a revenue side to that. So we're not raising the rates to generate $38 million for developer funded projects. There's developer funded revenue. They offset, they wash each other out. But as Ed mentioned, there's specific reasons why we have to show it in our capital.
But if I develop my plan on the 467 on my rate increases, it's inflated by that 38 million is what I was saying.
No, because all the revenue comes into effect when we're looking at rate increases. So we look at all of our sources of revenue.
For the purposes of the model, when we do these rate increases, that 38 million is not reflected anywhere in here, either way, expenditure side or revenue side, because it washes itself out because there's a matching developer contribution revenue to that. But it is part of your capital program and the assumptions we made. So it shows up here. We don't show you the revenue side of this. It's in your book, and under the capital program for water and sewer, you can actually look at the developer funded project and see both sides of that equation. It's actually in there, you can see the above and below the line. But we don't, for the purpose of this presentation, I didn't include it in here. But it's not, that is not at all what's driving your capital cost over time. Does that kind of answer that question? Kind of help you understand that a little bit better, maybe? Anything else? Okay. So, kind of going back, and I'll try to be mindful of our time, but I think I'm running short. Employee compensation, this is the same drivers, same 3% pool, employee benefits. So you kind of see the same trend throughout the entire budget. The biggest piece that you're going to see in the water and sewer capital fund is over time, the cost of this capital program becomes the bulk of the spending in the utility. And that was, the point of this is just to say, this is what's driving the cost and your rate increases over time in the water and sewer fund. It's not necessarily the operational side. As Ed mentioned, we're kind of keeping operations level, largely small incremental increases, just kind of inflationary with employee pay raises and those kinds of things. And trying to be judicious in where we add employees, to be more service oriented and maintain the system and so forth. Just kind of give you an idea, based on the current projections, this is how the water bill will look for the average water customer, water wastewater customer. If I were to draw this out, and this chart used to include all the years before, but I ran out of space to make it readable. If you remember, this is the first year that there was a rate increase in probably 10 years.
10 years.
So over time, the water rates weren't raised, and that's kind of where you got in the situation where you have this constant rate increase, because rates over time were not increased sufficiently to cover that system need and the growth in the system and kind of the ongoing capital need. So this is based, and you see it's a slow, gentle slope, and that's really what you want out of your rates. You don't want this jagged increase, peaked increases in each year. So you kind of see this gentle slope for the customer over time versus a jagged jump, from $60 to $80 over time. This is just what it's modeled at. Again, once you get past 17, these will be reviewed based on efficiencies, usage, all those other things before we make a water rate recommendation at that point. So BFDs, based on the direction that you gave us on the 20th, we went back through and did the calculations, looked at the funding, took out the one-time funding for trucks and the one-time equipment. In one case, a department had paid off debt service, so they didn't need that debt payment again. They had not requested that debt payment, so we reduced that from the general fund subsidy as well. So as you can see, in some cases, because the sales tax allocation changed, the rates went up and down accordingly. You can see a decrease in Henry Bridge, a slight decrease. Of course, these are all slight decreases. A decrease in Springs, a slight increase in Stallings because their sales tax allocation went down. Waxhaw was about the same, and then you saw about the same in Wesley Chapel. And that was to keep them on the funding side roughly level. And the same thing on the fire fees. Bakers, you see a slight fire fee decrease, and that's due to an increase in density. Griffith Road, you see that decrease, and that's largely due to a one-time funding of a truck last year. Jackson went down slightly because we're seeing an increase in the revenue side. And then New Salem, I believe that's where the debt payoff was.
Explain how Griffith Road went down because they got a truck last year.
We had $313,000 in that $100 fee.
Right, so we maxed out the fee first for the truck.
Okay.
Then we made up the difference with general fund subsidy. So then when you took the truck out of the equation because it was one time, it went way back down. Okay, so to kind of give you an idea then, this is how the funding has looked over the last, from 11 to the proposed 16. That decrease going from 1.5 million down to 1.1 is the truck at Griffith Road, the debt payment, some of those one-time items that we weeded out. And that's when I was talking about the 32, going from the 3212, how we were able to get that down a little bit is because that $500,000 or $400,000 difference here, that translated into rate savings, tax rate reduction, if you will, for the county-wide piece. On EMS, the general fund subsidy, this is kind of the picture of how it goes. Based on the personnel request and the expenditure request based on the contract, there is about a just under $1.4 million increase proposed. And most of that, if not all of that, goes to staffing. We are not recommending at this point replace any vehicles. We will probably be recommending, based on a fleet review with EMS, at some point in the year that they would use fund balance to do an initial replacement, but not at this time. Last I saw, they had about $2.3 million in fund balance in the last financials that we got last week. So we'll see, in conjunction with the EMS folks, again, if your contract says anything over $500,000, it's supposed to come back to the county. We recommend at this point we wait and see what it shakes out to be after the audits are all done and after the fleet audit is kind of complete, and then a planned replacement of vehicles can get started. But this is to provide staffing so that by January they can meet their 14 and 11 staffing levels.
I believe there were 24 new positions
Right.
as part of this request.
It's about a $1.3 million increase, give or take, just for staffing. So there were some other areas we cut them back in.
It was how much?
About 1.3 million for staffing, give or take. And that's to allow, I believe it's about 108% staffing level to be able to cover callbacks and overtime and that kind of stuff.
Well, like we just discussed earlier, and previously, they weren't even staffing to the 9 and 11 that they were supposed to. And going to the 14 and 11 will justify that staffing
Absolutely.
expectation.
What you're seeing here is the net impact of the increased service level that's being provided. The staffing level that's required to meet the deployment model, as well as the response times. The original request was a little over $8 million. So we did cut that back pretty healthy, a pretty big cut, about 1.6 million, I think is what the number was. And that will, and I'm going to give you a little bit of caution on this, because we are talking about a little bit of a short-term strategy when we start talking about vehicle replacement and fleet replacement, because there will need to be, at some point, an ongoing fleet replacement program. We're not to the point yet where we have a good handle on what that has to be. So this does not include a long-term fleet replacement program. This only includes the staffing piece to get them to the 14 and 11 deployment model. There will be probably next year an additional component added into that equation for ongoing replacement of units. And the units between 200 and 250,000, if I remember right, and that includes everything that goes in it. So this is where we are now. That will change based on next year. And the same thing with the VFDs. This is where we are now, and the 3.11 is where we are now. When we go through that VFD process, the final outcome of that will, in some way and fashion, change that 311. So that 311 snapshot that you have this year on the public safety, the EMS and fire tax, is this year. Based on the outcome of some of these other things, that will probably change. And we haven't modeled that because I don't have a basis to model that.
The 3.11 is a projection. I assume that our fire taxes and fire fees are still in place.
Yep.
And they are not part of the ad valorem tax. The 311 is a comparison, right?
No, the 311 is what you're actually paying, the general fund subsidy plus what you're paying for EMS on fire. So that is with the fire fees and other fire taxes all still in place. That's what you're still paying on your ad valorem rate for those two services.
Fire is still 0.67, right?
It's actually right around 0.5 now.
Okay.
So it's the 1.1, our total tax generates about 2.3 cents. So it's like 4.5, 4.8, something in that neighborhood. Your biggest chunk of that 311 is EMS. It's I believe like 2.88 cents or something like that, or 2.7 cents. But I just want to be sure that you understand where we were able to model the general fund, because we have a good handle on the general fund. There's enough moving parts right now in EMS and VFDs. I don't have a good enough handle on it to model it, but it will change because I know we don't have unit replacement as part of the EMS budget, and we don't have the long-term capital replacement and all those other components of the VFDs. And I just didn't want to come to next year this time and everyone go, well, why is it 6, 7 cents? Depending upon the funding and how you structure the funding, it could be any number of combinations. So I just want to be real clear about that. Community partners, as you can see, we have, in our community partners, it's about 4.7 million, 4.6 million proposed this year. And these are the community partners we funded. This is the same list we funded for 3 or 4 years now.
I think this is our fourth year.
Fourth year.
I think it was in our first budget year in 2011 where the board identified there would be no new agencies that we funded. And that I think there was a caveat, we would limit them to no more than 2% growth. We also were to look at their fund balances, and depending upon their fund balances as to whether or not we funded them at all.
Right, so what you see here is mostly 2%. Now, I will say some of these aren't part of that calculation, because you can see the clerk of the Superior Court, the district attorney's office, the magistrates, economic development incentives are included in here. South Piedmont's included in this conversation. Some of the others that aren't judges' offices and so forth, while they got their 2%, in some cases, some were above and below. So where they came in and requested less than their 2%, we plugged in the less than 2% request. Safer Communities, their contract last year was actually less than what the budget required, so that's, this amount for Safer Communities is 2% growth on their contract amount, not what we budgeted for them. So that's why they're a little less. If you remember back in November, you budgeted one-time money for Health Quest for capital needs. What you see now is the reduction of that one-time funding. The economic development incentives are down. That's just because those start to trail off over time. And South Piedmont College is not at 2% because the $500,000 component of their capital funds remained flat. We did give the 2% on the operating, which was kind of how we structured it last year, was to give them ongoing funding, level funding for capital over time. So you see their total increase is about 0.6% when you take into consideration that fixed amount. Other than that, we kind of give this to you informationally so you can see where those increases and decreases are across the board. Most of them are 2%. Those that are not, there's specific reasons why. In addition, not all of this is cash to the outside agency. Some of these folks, particularly when you're looking at, I believe, Health Quest and some of those other areas, they inhabit our space. So this could include in-kind contributions, telephones, office space, maintenance of space, that kind of stuff, facilities charges. So it's not, all of this is not cash directly to these individual components. Some are, some aren't. So it kind of ranges the system. But this is when we talk about community partners. This is the bulk of what we're talking about as far as outside agencies go. Are there any questions concerning this?
Safer Communities is since that's all at the jail facility, is that some of that in kind, or is that all cash?
No, that's all
a
cash for
contract.
Safer Communities.
Because it works out to be about $1,200 for each inmate that graduates from your program.
You as a board, I put this up here knowing that there was some different concerns this year related to those community partners. What we do is we follow the policy. In fact, it's probably the one area in the budget we don't really tweak or do anything with. I will say on South Piedmont, we meet with Dr. Cedar and his group and kind of go through his requests and make recommendations based on that. But the remainder of these kind of come from your policy, and the 2% is an automatic unless you tell us otherwise. So we gave you the list. If you want to change the list and tweak the list to how you see fit, we're happy to make whatever changes you would like for us to make on that. So, and we can dig up any other information if you have a question concerning any of those.
What happened with the magistrate's office? I know it's not much money, but
Well, what happened in all of these situations is, I don't know what happened there. But what we found is that all of these came to us even prior to my coming in 2010, was state reduced their funding in order to continue to, I mean, they came to us to ask for books, to ask for,
Software, I mean, it runs the gambit. I can find out exactly what happened in the magistrate's office. I will say on Safer Communities real quick, this does not reflect the secondary request that we got from them. There was a second ask from Safer Communities, I believe it was like $30,000.
I think it was for the women's program.
Yeah, so this recommendation is based on your policy of 2% over the
You
contract.
cut it back considerably.
So that is, on Safer Communities, this is not what they asked for. This is what the policy says that we should give them from that perspective. But again, any of these that you want us to look into or that you want to talk about taking out or changing, some are mandated probably from, I think, HealthQuest. We give some ABC revenues and those kinds of things to some of these programs, and we can drill down and get that information for you. I think that information is in your book, but we can also find some additional information if you feel like you want additional information related to those. Again, economic development incentives are based on contracts. Okay, so that's kind of the last part of the budget. The next steps, kind of as Cindy alluded to, we have a calendar, and this is a tentative calendar. Obviously, you guys can change it at any point. May 15th, we anticipate getting the school board budget request. May 18th, we'll have a public hearing concerning the county manager's proposed budget and VFD funding. May 18th, at that same time, this was a little different than I think the bifurcated slide. So we're going to ask for a tentative approval of the manager's budget. We've slated some time for a joint meeting with the school board. That is obviously up to the chairs of those two groups. We have some time built into the process for that. The 21st, we will do our addendum to the budget as we did last year. There is a general statute requirement that by June 1st, the manager give you the full budget. What you have now is the budget less schools. So to meet that statutory requirement, we're going to give you what we refer to as the schools addendum on the 21st is our goal, assuming we get it all in from the schools in a timely manner and everything. So we'll give you the addendum to the budget, and that will complete the manager's proposed budget for your deliberation and check off that statutorily required benchmark. We'll have the public hearing concerning the UCPS on June 1st. We've slated, because we're mindful that you prefer to have some time in between the public hearing and the adoption of the budget. Right now we have a special meeting for the required public hearing on June 8th. That'll be up to you. We're asking that if you want to do that, that we do that. And then on June 15th, we'd like to get the whole budget adopted through the commission. Now these can, of course, slide up and back depending upon what your direction is. You have to adopt a budget in some form or fashion by June 30. I will tell you from an administrative perspective that the further you keep us from June 30, the better off we are as an organization, because what I have to do is take everything you tell us and adopt, translate that so that on July 1, we can flip our system on and everything works for July 1. If you do it on June 30, that doesn't leave me much window to be sure we can pay the bills on July 1. But we're happy to do whatever you would like as a commission. So, plus there's some vacation time scheduled in there somewhere. So
For somebody.
But this is the tentative schedule that we would recommend to you. As we did last year, we're kind of continuing our process. We have a budget website set up at our website. We also have Ask the Manager, and we have public comment. We'll take those, and any that we get, we'll provide to you. Last year we didn't get a ton, so there wasn't a ton of information provided through that. So other than that, additional information again can be found on our website. So with that, I'll take any questions, or I'm done. And probably went a little long, so I apologize.
There's no schedule for the schools to present their budget to us, is there? They just pass it over to you?
They usually send it to me.
Okay.
The superintendent will send it to me and ask to send it to me no later than May 15th.
Will you get it electronically or on paper?
I usually get it both ways.
Yeah, it's usually a scanned copy. But what
Not
we'll do,
PDF or, I mean, it's just going to be a scan.
It's a scan.
Usually that's what it is, yeah.
that's what that joint meeting date
Yeah,
is
that-
built into the calendar. If you want them to come over, and that traditionally the last couple of years, that's what that meeting date was used for, was for them to present on some level their budget, and that's for you and their chair. to
Well,
work out.
I think we ought to invite Chairman Collins and staff to come present it, because we don't want to misinterpret it. And having a face-to-face and understanding what their request is, we think will be beneficial. Is that agree?
And if we can get it, other than a scanned copy, anything electronically which would help
We will
identify documents.
certainly make that request.
Please.
Okay. Thank you, sir.
Thank you all very much.